Hello and welcome to ADEC's In Conversation special series addressing COVID-19. I'm your series moderator, Dr. Jill Harrington, coming to you from our nation's capital, the Washington, D.C. area. Also joining me here in conversation is Mr. Isaiah Allen, ADEC's Executive Director, coming to us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today in conversation, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 and the expressive arts. So joining me here today is Sharon Strouse. Sharon's a licensed clinical art therapist who maintains an art therapy, psychotherapy private practice in the Baltimore, Maryland area. She's also the associate director of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. She's also been the Artful Grief Studio director at the TAPS National Suicide Seminar for the past decade. And she's the author of Artful Grief. Also with us here today is Sarah Vollmann. Sarah is a licensed clinical social worker and art therapist. Sarah maintains a private practice in the Boston area where she specializes in grief and loss. Sarah also worked with Sharon for the past 3 years as part of the Artful Grief team. And Sarah works as well with adolescents at the BB&N School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Sarah, I'm sorry if I called you Sharon right there in the introduction.
Okay.
I'm exposing my own vulnerability here. And then finally, we have Dr. Barbara Thompson, who's also a licensed clinical social worker. Dr. Thompson is a professor at the Sage Colleges in Troy, New York. She's the author of Grief and the Expressive Arts, Practices for Creating Meaning with Bob Niemeyer, as well as the author of Prescriptive Memories in Grief and Loss, The Art of Dreamscaping with Nancy Gershman. So thank you all for joining us here today. I wanted to start off by asking each one of you, you're art therapists, and you're also members of ADEC. How did you get involved in ADEC? And can you tell us any memories of your time at ADEC?
Well, I guess I'll start. For me, I went to a conference a few years ago, the one that was out in Portland, Oregon, and it was really exciting for me to be there. I've specialized in working with grief and loss throughout my career, but I kind of discovered ADEC just, I guess it was 4 or 5 years ago now, and it was honestly one of the best conferences I've ever attended. I went to Bob Niemeyer's class, which I loved, of course, and was so excited to find this community of other professionals across disciplines working with grief and loss. So I'm really happy to be a part of this community.
How did you find it, Sarah?
I was doing research, and of course I was familiar with Bob's work, and then I saw that he was teaching that class, and I was so excited to go and learn with him, and so that was really what brought me to ADEC and to the conference.
Why do you think it's a good place for art therapists to be? Not many of you there.
Well, I think art therapists have a very special place in the work that we're doing, and with grief and loss, and it's important for us to be connecting to other professionals across disciplines with the type of work that we're doing. So I would encourage other art therapists to check it out and to come be a part of it, especially anyone who's interested in doing this type of work with bereavement.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. Sarah, Sharon, I keep finding Sharon.
We can interchange our names. It's fine.
We're very linked, aren't we, Sharon?
So closely as a team, it's hard to tell you apart sometimes.
That's true. So I was introduced to ADEC by you, Jill, who in 2012 said, you know what, you should try to get involved. And I sent in a proposal, and it was accepted as a poster presentation. And the poster presentation was some of the artwork that I had created, collage work that I had created in response to my daughter Kristen's suicide in 2001. And you so kindly introduced me to everyone. I met Bob Niemeyer there. I also took his pre-conference training. And it really changed my life. Not only do I feel the ADEC community is my tribe, just like the art therapy community, but because my focus is so much in grief and bereavement, it's a wonderful place, for me to be a participant as well as a workshop presenter there. So I've loved it.
We are so fortunate to have you there too, Sharon. I'm so glad you become part of the community. Barbara, you've been the longest standing member of the ADEC community out of all of us here.
I have been, and I consider ADEC to be my professional home. I was finishing up as a student in social work back in the mid-90s and heard about ADEC through Carla Sofka, who was one of my professors. I was also doing some work with Barbara Jones, who was a licensed clinical social worker at the Albany Medical Center Oncology Hematology Pediatric Program, and we were working on use of expressive arts with the adolescents. So both references, I decided to go. It was in Pittsburgh, and immediately was struck by the warmth of everyone at ADEC, even though it was a big conference with over 600 participants. I felt at home. It was a wonderful interprofessional community, and the dialogue was just incredible. And also, I would have to say that it's a lot of fun, which seems counterintuitive, perhaps, considering that it's focusing on death, dying, grief, and loss. But it has been just, it's been my professional home for many years. I've been an occupational therapist working in hospice and palliative care for 17 years previously. So I was looking for a place to call home, and this has been it. Thank you.
Barbara, I'd have to agree with you on that. I always say that being over 20 years in social work and working with people with, you know, life-threatening illnesses, people who are dying, and those who are bereaved, that I think that one of the things as a social worker working in that field, it gives me a deeper appreciation for life. And it's really great to be around people who actually know the meaning of joy in the world, and a deeper appreciation sometimes for just being together and sharing in those moments while you're still alive and healthy and able to do it. So thank you so much, each of you, for sharing that with us here today, how you came to ADEC and we need more expressive art therapists at ADEC, and it's a great community that you're all there. But let me just ask you a question. What are the expressive arts? So we've been throwing this word around. I want to assume that everybody knows. And why are they relevant in the context you think of COVID-19?
Well, I think that humans have an innate capacity for creative expression and resilience in the face of adversity, and that this capacity to respond creatively and adaptively to changing circumstances and environments like our current circumstance and to loss is part of our evolutionary heritage. The expressive arts include dance, music making, art making, creative writing, building things, sharing stories, and the expressive arts are used for both celebration and during times of mourning. And we have used the arts as human beings across cultures and for thousands of years. So I think they're an innate part of who we are, part of our innate capacity. I think that the expressive arts can be seen as forms of expressive language, ways of communicating our human experience. And I think the expressive arts as a language, an alternative language, can be especially helpful when experiences such as what we're going through now with COVID are difficult to put into words. The arts can be very helpful with traumatic experiences when there are no words. My sense of the coronavirus is that it's been so sudden, global, and it's so pervasive and ongoing that for all of us, it's disrupted the rhythms of our daily lives, our social networks, and we're living in this field of uncertainty where there's no clear end in sight. And so we're all responding and having to adapt on a daily basis. For me, the COVID-19 is different than some types of loss, ambiguous and also death-related, because it's invisible and it's ubiquitous, not only in terms of the threat of death, but also in terms of our assumptions and plans for the future. So in this ocean of change, it seems important to find islands of safety and rest or restoration to bolster our adaptive capabilities. It's a very altered environment. I was out the other day enjoying the springtime and looking at everything starting to come to life, and also aware that I was simultaneously paying attention to who was wearing a mask, who was, social distancing. So it's this very altered environment that we're living in. Recently, I heard about the Corona Anxiety Scale, which you may have heard about through some of the recent presentations. It was developed, for those who are not aware of it, in March of 2020 and just published in Des Studies. And it's a brief screening tool for symptoms of anxiety associated with the COVID-19 crisis. And high CAS scores are associated with significant functional impairments. What I found interesting is that the clinical symptoms they were assessing were dizziness, sleep disturbance, feeling frozen, appetite loss, and nausea, all of the somatic responses to the perception of threat and trauma. So this really struck me in relation to use of the expressive arts. Some of the symptoms of sympathetic hyperarousal are probably familiar to us personally and in the reports of our clients, like sleep disturbance, increased body tension, changes in breathing, GI function, as well as a state of hypervigilance. We're sort of scanning for danger when we go out. So these automatic physiological responses, though are part of our biological heritage and mobilize us to take action. But again, I think the threat of COVID-19 is unique because of its invisibility and its pervasiveness and also its global nature. Everyone's affected. And it's also unclear what kind of world we're going to inhabit on the other side of COVID-19 and when we're going to actually reach that other side. There's a great deal of uncertainty. When circumstances overwhelm and exhaust our ability to assimilate and respond to traumatic events, the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, and so there can be a state of freeze or collapse. And we can also find, to a greater or lesser extent, that we're moving between states of hyperarousal and feeling sort of frozen. So it's important to find ways for each of us and with our clients to move in what's called our window of tolerance. The expressive arts and other somatic approaches are very helpful in modulating these types of somatic responses because they are sensory rich and they engage both the body and mind in creative acts. And with creative activities, I also want to include things like knitting, sewing, stitching together, gardening, anything that engages our senses in the immediate moment and engages our creative imagination can help to regulate the nervous system and can also be shared with others. I think also the arts importantly provide moments of pleasure. And I know for myself, it's been really helpful to engage in art making as a respite from this sort of disembodied virtual world that we're inhabiting for so many hours during the day. Activities in particular that involve bilateral activity, crossing the midline, proprioceptive activities, pressure, involving pressure, touch, pushing, using materials in that way, vestibular input where you may, with movement have rocking or swaying of the body. All of these types of movements and activities engage various sensory motor systems that can help with self-regulation, either by soothing a sympathetically aroused nervous system or by activating us when we feel a little paralyzed, numb, or shut down, a little disconnected. And importantly, I think also these types of activities ground us in the midst of change and engage our creative capacities and can serve as a bridge to language, to talking about and to putting into words what we're experiencing because they provide some kind of reflective distance. And lastly, I think they, for me, have widened sort of my expressive range by starting with, for instance, a drawing and then looking at it and finding words and then talking in our art group, which Sharon and Sarah and I will talk about later. That has given me a way to give language to an experience that is very much emerging and unfamiliar. So in these ways, I think it helps us to bear witness to what is happening in our lives, both personally and collectively. In using the arts, I want to emphasize the process of art making. I think that some people, when thinking about using the arts, say, well, I'm not an artist, I don't have any ability, this is not something I feel comfortable with. And so the emphasis really is on the process of art making. And Paulo Nil is an expressive arts therapist, and he has a phrase that I really like called low skill, high sensitivity. So the emphasis is not on the technical skill, but rather on the process, being very sensitive to the materials and the process of art making. And this needs to be emphasized when offering an invitation to somebody to engage in art making. So I think that in the changing landscape that we now inhabit, where there's a lot of unwanted and unexpected change, we're all finding ways to adapt creatively and constructively and to shape what has been given to us with the materials that we have available to us, while remembering that as a species, we are remarkably resilient. And I think that our capacity to create in the midst of things falling apart, in the midst of the mess of the way things are, for many of us is a gift, and it's an innate capacity that we can draw upon as we recreate our lives. So we'd like to share some ideas on how to incorporate art-assisted approaches in working with people experiencing COVID-19 related distress and trauma, with a few caveats and cautions regarding their use because they can be very provocative. As well as some resources for clinicians. And lastly, and I think importantly, we'd like to talk about how to use art-based and creative approaches for us as clinicians to enhance our ability to assist others even in a virtual environment. And I'd like to turn the screen over to Sarah now, who will talk more in depth about the importance of sensitivity to materials, choosing materials, and inviting people to work with different kinds of materials.
Sarah, thank you so very much. Can you elaborate on the types of materials you might use and talk about why it's so important to take the materials into consideration?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. As art therapists, materials are something that we think about so much, that we're really trained to understand and to choose with a lot of care and choice. So as we're going in to do an art therapy session with somebody, we are thinking very much about what materials, and we're also thinking about what we call the art therapy directive, which is really not really a directive, it's much more of an invitation in terms of what we might suggest someone might want to do with materials along with the materials that we're offering. So for me, I'd say one rule of thumb that I kind of always keep at heart is kind of thinking about how much structure someone needs as you're starting out with them in an art therapy process. And something that is really important to keep in mind is really that you want to, as the therapist, offer them as much structure as they need, but never too much structure, because if you offer too much structure, you could kind of thwart what the process might be in terms of their expression. But you want there to be enough structure so that it feels contained and held, because really it's a process, and it's all about also the relationship that you're providing with the person that you're working with. So to give an example, the other thing I want to say is that you also start in a certain place with somebody with materials and with a directive, but that you're constantly assessing as you move throughout time with that patient in terms of what they need and how things are going. So for example, there was a young girl I was working with at one time who was bereaved. She was an 8-year-old bereaved girl, and she was working, this was a kid who was having a very hard time kind of expressing a lot of her sadness. She was keeping a lot of feelings bottled up for numerous reasons. And I'd worked with her for some time. She was working on a kind of memory box. And then she decided to do some painting with me. And what was interesting was that you know, and again, everyone's going to bring their own ideas and reactions to the materials, which are always so interesting to see how things, we never know how things are going to evolve when we sit down with someone in the creative process, right? We never really know what direction things might take. But she had decided to kind of color code the paint with some of her feelings. So for example, she had decided that the color blue represented her sadness. And as she was working on this box, she decided to start painting on the box. And she'd worked on the box for many weeks, but she had never touched the bottom of the box, which was, you know, kind of symbolic of kind of the crux and the underbelly of some of her feelings that she'd never gotten close to. But that day she ended up flipping the box over and she started to paint on it with this blue paint, and was talking again about blue being the color of sadness and the sadness that was underneath, and really kind of putting into words some of her experience and her feelings. Which was good because, like I said before, she'd held that sadness very tightly and it felt very frightened kind of about letting it out in the session and with me. So as she was doing this, she was painting, and then she ended up taking the container of blue paint and she started pouring it onto the box. So all of a sudden this blue paint is becoming this flow of paint that's coming onto the box. It's starting to go onto the box, dripping down the box, going onto the table. And it was such an important kind of symbolization, and really she was sharing with me kind of the depth of this sadness and also how overwhelming the sadness was and kind of how unending it felt and how scary it felt, but that she felt safe in that room and in the relationship with me to kind of let it out and to show me. So it was an interesting moment as an art therapist that I was seeing this happen. And on one hand, of course, I didn't want to say, okay, stop, the paint's overflowing. Finally, this kid is letting these feelings out. I didn't want to just, you know, immediately put an end to that when I was trying to help her really let those feelings out in a safe and contained way. I also didn't want things to become really overwhelming and kind of feel destructive to her as she was letting these feelings out. So just in the same way that we would act as verbal therapists when we're worried about having a patient flooding or something like that, we have to use the supplies to contain and to consider how to keep people safe and how to help them pace themselves in their process. So she was pouring this paint, and you know, if it had continued, it was going to go onto the table, onto our clothes, onto the carpet, which, you know, we didn't want it to go that far. So I asked her if she'd like to print from some of the paint and make some prints, and she liked that idea. So pretty soon she was taking pieces of paper and she was soaking the paint up with this paper, and in that way she was making these prints, and she decided to call them her sadness prints. And she was pouring and printing and pouring and printing, and she did this big process of that so that the pouring had a place and she could keep the paint coming out and keep the sadness coming out, but that it was contained and it was actually given form that she then had to keep and look at later. So that's just one example of how this child used materials, and how in the session we had to keep evolving in terms of how we were using those materials. So I just want to say art therapists are kind of constantly assessing as materials are going on and adding, subtracting, containing, helping. And of course, it's all in the relationship too. I do want to make a plug for that too, because you can have the most clever art therapy directive in the world, but if you don't have that relationship with the person that you're working with, it doesn't really matter, right? It's all really in the relationship and in that back and forth that happens between yourself and the person. So what I mentioned before about structure, I think anyone who thinks about art supplies can think about how different an experience can be. Say, if you're drawing with pencil, that's something that's clearly very structured, right? And that's a very different experience if we think about it versus sinking our hands into like a big pile of very wet, messy clay and kind of touching that clay. That those two experiences are very, very different. And, you know, as we sit with a patient, we're going to be thinking about kind of what that patient might need, what might be helpful. And another example might be one time I was working with a teenager who was really angry and kind of didn't really know what to do with those feelings. And clay was a really great modality at that moment for that teenager. because this teenager ended up taking the clay, was pounding on the clay. So here they were kind of given a physical outlet in which they could really express their anger that wasn't destructive, it was actually really constructive. And they were able to kind of, again, share with me in the space, in the container of the therapeutic relationship, share about their anger with this clay. And for a long time, it was really just the pounding on the clay and nothing else. And so we could sit in the room with that anger. And then after time, after some of that was kind of acknowledged and shared and validated in the room, then there was an experience of then taking the clay and building something with it. And that turned, so there was a transformation that happened in that process with the materials. So those are just two examples of how we might use materials with patients. And the other piece I wanted to touch upon too is that the art studio is also something that we think of that's an additional container. And the way that we set up an art studio is also very well thought out. One of the many reasons I love working so much with Sharon is she and I, when we work at TAPS, put together a studio. And Sharon and I both care so much about bringing so much thought into how the materials are presented. So we don't want someone to walk into the room and find a table that's just a big jumble of, you know, tangled yarn and scrappy fabric and scissors underneath and, you know, glue drips on the floor or anything like that. We really want people to come in to find a space that's very inviting, to find materials that are really accessible. And, you know, and we're kind of going around the room and we're keeping that, we're keeping everything in order. We're keeping things in a certain way so that people feel, and it's in some ways our way of symbolically caring for all the people who come in, right? That we're providing this space that's inviting, that's well thought out, and that the studio also then becomes, you know, in addition to our work, the studio itself becomes part of the container for the experience of people walking in. So right now, this is an interesting time because we've all moved to working virtually. So we've lost that experience about setting up the studio, which is obviously the ideal setup for an art therapist. Sharon has some wonderful work that she's been doing virtually with some of her patients. And I know I'd love to hear more about her sharing about how she's been doing some of that virtual work as an art therapist, because it's an interesting jump that we've all been making.
I just want to make a plug for the amount of material you have at the art studio and the variety of material that you have. I knew that last time at ADEC, we had the Artful Grief Studio.
Yes.
You open it up to the members to come and share, you know, and I am an anxious artist. It's not my medium, as Barbara was talking about before. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist and I don't necessarily love drawing or paint. I love writing and music. That's my thing. But you all had superhero material there last time. So I actually sat down and created something. So I connected with the material you had and I made little symbols of hope through each of my little superheroes. And it was awesome, the variety of materials that were offered, because if not, I probably wouldn't have engaged with the material.
Well, that's such a great point, Jill, because part of not only having things set up nicely, but part of the important piece is also having a wide range of materials so that people, just as you mentioned, can connect with those materials in some different way. And there's this kind of almost magical thing that happens, that maybe somebody comes in and they connect to the superhero fabric for whatever reason that really touches them in some way. Or so if we have a wide selection of things, there's those connections that can happen that are really important as part of somebody's creative process, and then takes them down a road that maybe they hadn't even imagined before walking into the room.
Sharon, I know that you're going to maybe share with us a little bit about virtually the collages and the elements of this that you've been doing with people.
Yeah, I'm so thankful, Sarah, for you really setting the stage for, you know, what the challenges are for us as art therapists going forward with COVID-19. Because we have to take into consideration everything that you've talked about. We're no longer in our studios, and materials, that's a real problem. So I realized at the beginning of March, that's when all of my groups and my individual clients, all that ended, because I have a home studio and home office, and clients and groups weren't going to be happening here anymore. And so I was really challenged. How am I going to meet the needs of both my individual clients and my groups. And to really think out of the box, which you had to kind of, let's go here. There was no time. And Zoom conferencing has been a godsend. And basically, you know, what I did is send out an email invitation. We're going to be doing it by Zoom. And the groups that I had, they were basically collage groups. Based on the years of creating collages in response to my own loss, Kristen's death in 2001, her suicide. So I was heavily into collage, and that certainly is a foundational element. And what I love about collage is that it's really accessible to everybody. Everybody has a magazine, scissors and glue, which is perfect for where we are now. If you're at home, you know, you can at least find that, or you can canvas your neighborhood and say, hey, you know, I'm looking for magazines. So there's that element to collage. But what I particularly like is working with the pieces, the fragments, the parts. And I think Barbara spoke to that. For those who are traumatized, working with collage is just an amazing modality, where what is fragmented, you literally get to glue that down. There's some organization to it. So the 3-hour collage groups that I had at home, which would start with, you know, touching in with everybody, how are you, you know, doing today, you know, doing a little bit guided meditation, and then having an hour to create and an hour to process. So that all I had to let go of and figure out, how do I create something that's intimate with these groups of clients that I was working with. I think the important thing too to consider, at least for me, was I had ongoing relationships with all of these clients that I knew that they would be fine creating at home. And so we set it up that way where, you know, they were free to create during the week. And then I set up a 2-hour Zoom Corona collage circle. And we would meet, touch base with each other, and have a short guided meditation, and then spend the rest of the time in process. I had full confidence that they could do creating independently. And because I'd been working with them for years, I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to be witness to the process. And it gave people, you know, a real outlet to how they're feeling, a sense of community. They weren't isolated. And it was just like we were together, you know, in the studio setting. So I have 2 images that I wanted to share. So if you could bring up image 1. And this was done by, a woman. Part of it is painting, it's watercolor, and part of it is collage. And what she said is, you know, this angel is doing battle with what is unformed and invisible. And you can see, you know, this sword kind of going through a cloud. Feathers, which, you know, she was really kind of talking to those in spirit who have passed on. Butterfly, you know, she talked about in terms of transformation. And interesting, I'm seeing a lot of images with crowns. So Corona, you know, is crown. And so you can see a crown on this angel's head. Do you want to show image 2? And this was done by someone who said, you know what, I don't have magazines. I'm not going to go and get magazines, but I do have oil pastels. And so what she did is this is very kind of corona, you know, circle, the cross on the inside that, you know, really speaks to her fears on her own, you know, mortality. And there you see at the bottom the crown again. I think that's fascinating that that image keeps coming up repeatedly for people. And she also, you know, she said it was so wonderful, and Barbara brought this up, you know, to put the pressure on that red craypas and really kind of grind it into the paper and really get her emotions out in a way that really felt good to her. And so these were just two of the images that have come from that group. And so that has been working really very well. I do have a couple of one-on-one clients who are used to having a 1.5-hour session with me. This one woman in particular, the structure of that session is she comes in, she sits down at the table, and she starts to create. And for the whole 1.5 hours, we sit and we talk through her process. That's kind of how she's used to working. And so, you know, that was fine. She said, I think we can work this out. People need to be, you know, very open to possibility and change. And I think we as art therapists have to hold the space for that also, to be in a place of curiosity and willingness. And hey, you know, we're all trying to figure this out together. And so she said, I don't have collage material. And what she said is, and this came from her. I mean, I was just like amazed at her resourcefulness. She went out in her backyard and she collected about 25 objects from her backyard: leaves, vines, sticks, all different kinds of stone, moss. And she sat down at her table, which was round, so I loved that. It's kind of mandala shaped, very holding. And she arranged them in a pattern and talked about it. And it had such depth and such meaning for her. And so that is just such a beautiful example of how you can let your imagination, you know, expand to using things that are found objects in your backyard. And she now is in a process of continuing to use those 25 objects from her backyard, and not really daily, but every couple of days she will rearrange them, look at them. How have they changed? How is that pattern different from how it was the time before? And kind of writing a little bit of what she's feeling, which I think that's really brilliant. That's really creative. And it's not really different from collage. She's working with pieces. They're just pieces in nature. So it all works together beautifully. And I think you just have to let go of the old form, which is what I did, how I worked in my studio with groups and one-on-one, and allow for something completely new to come in, to be birthed. And that's where we are as art therapists and expressive arts therapists.
What a beautiful and very powerful story of what your client was doing, finding her own material to work with.
Yeah.
I know Sharon's often a guest lecturer in my Introduction to Grief Counseling class, and my students can't wait to do collage with her. So very, very powerful medium that she found for herself. And thanks for sharing the artwork, the virtual collage artwork you've been doing. I'm wondering, Sarah, if you could maybe show us an image and talk about your work with maybe one of your clients.
Yeah, that would be great. And Jill, if you don't mind, could you bring up image number 3 for people to see? This is a patient I wanted to share about who, This is a young woman who is currently a senior in high school who drew this, and someone that I've worked with for quite a long time. And as she and I were talking, I had said to her, I was wondering if she'd like to create some type of image around her that just maybe would kind of represent her experience of this time of COVID. And this is the image that she came with. So, which I found to be really, really poignant. So to tell you a little bit more about her, she, like I mentioned, she's a senior in high school. Her family actually has been directly touched by illness, as she has somebody in her extended family who does have COVID. So there's been a lot of worry about that family member, and also about the family members who live with that person, and wondering if that's gonna spread to those people as well. And then, as you can imagine, as a senior in high school, obviously, you know, she's home now. School's been shut down for her, as it has for everyone. But it's a really interesting and intense time for a senior to have this happen, because here it is, a time that there's so many rituals, right? This was senior spring, is such a time that is so rich in times of ritual and transformation, all the plans and kind of milestones that people look forward to that have kind of all been wiped off of the calendar because of this virus. And it's also a time where many or most seniors in high school are kind of in a process of maybe separating from home and launching into something new and different. And instead, here she is, and she's at home. She has plans to go to college in the fall, but that's, you know, up in the air, wondering kind of if that's going to happen, if so, how that's going to happen, if there's going to be, you know, a start from home. So everything really is, you know, for her, as it is for all of us, really up in the air, but it's an intense time for a senior to have this happen. So this is the image that she created. So it's made with marker on paper, and what she had said was, you know, all she had at home was marker, and she didn't really like marker. I think she did a beautiful job. But again, I think that's symbolic of all of us kind of having to work with what we have right now, which is such a big piece of kind of what we're in right now with this mess with being home. So she made this image, and what she told me about it is that it's a picture from being inside the car and looking out, which again, I think resonates so much with me, and I think with all of us, we could sit with that right now her experience kind of is like, she can see what's on the outside, but she can't quite access it, right? She's feeling trapped inside. There's this beautiful landscape outside, but she is inside. There's this wall and this barrier, which is kind of all of our experience, right? As we are kind of quarantined at home and can't really live our lives as openly or as freely as we want to right now. And what she told me was that she decided to create on the outside this one of her favorite places, kind of this beautiful landscape. So there is some hopefulness, I think, in this image, as well as some kind of sadness and feeling trapped. There's this hopefulness in that image of this very beautiful place. And if you see, there's like, she made this one tiny little house out there in the landscape. She talked about how that's where she wanted to be. And then as we talked through it a little more, we both also agreed that this little house is very alone out there, and how that also, if we looked at that as a self symbol, that also could really represent her experience of feeling very isolated right now at this time. And then really the centerpiece of the picture, right, as you can see kind of the opening and kind of the lock, the door of the car door, that's kind of, you know, a barrier, right, that we're kind of behind this door and behind this barrier between us and this beautiful place that we would ideally like to be, right? So I think it just sums up so beautifully really what her experience is. And I also want to point to the way that she used the markers and used the materials, which I hope people can see in the picture. I think her use of line is so beautiful. You can see that she's kind of made these long lines, these kind of long brush strokes almost with the marker to, you know, fill in the space. So her, you know, it's very beautiful, and it's very controlled, right? The way that she's kind of very carefully drawn with these very elaborate lines of direction of how she wants to go. So in that way, she really took the materials and used them in a very controlled way. So here it is that we're in a situation that she doesn't have any control over, like, so many factors about what's happening right now, but she used the supplies and took control with these supplies that weren't even the supplies that she really wanted, but she used them in a way that she used in a very controlled way. She took control, and she was really, really pleased and happy with this final image, and kind of felt a sense of mastery and control after making this and using these materials to make something that she was proud of, and that she could say really illustrated kind of and summed up her experience of this time.
So how can we use these approaches, you think, as clinicians, both with our clients and maybe for ourselves?
So that's really, you know, something that really I started to think about and deal with way at the beginning of March as everything started to get closed down. And my own mounting, you know, fears, anxieties, you know, stepping into the unknown, what's going on. And I found myself, you know, going down into my studio by myself and starting to create images. So if you want to bring up that first one. So this was prior to our group getting together. And I remember calling Sarah, and it was after like evening news. And that seemed to be, you know, this was really the beginning of March. I think it was the second one I'm going to show you was, the first, within the first week. And there was this just spike of fear. Like all of a sudden I felt like this panic, like, oh my gosh. And this was one of the early collages that I did. And you can just see, you don't have to be an art therapist. There's that scream and all the words that are around where I just felt like news, you know, everything that you're reading, it just was like you're coming in on you and the world coming apart, splitting apart and splitting open. And Sarah had started to make quilts, squares in response. And, you know, here we were creating separately. And I said, you know what, I think we need a group. Let's a bunch of us get together. And there it was born. We kind of got together, Portland Institute faculty and presenters, and a bunch of us, Bob Niemeyer also, and Laura Krychek in Philadelphia. And we formed a group, and we've been meeting on Sundays at 3 o'clock and sharing our artwork. If you want to bring up the image 2. So I think it has been, I know for me, well, and here's a beautiful example. Okay, so you saw the trauma, the fragmentation, and, you know, the disintegration. But then on the heels of that is a more healing image. So, you know, I looked at it, you know, and said, dual process model there in operation, you know, from loss orientation to something that's very restorative. But what was wonderful was being able to share with other clinicians. And so, you know, this Sunday group has meant everything, you know, to me as far as creating and sharing, you know, and what it's doing too is preparing us. We have to do our own work in this. You know, we're as much in it as our clients. You know, in what way are we getting the support that we need, you know, to work with these images, to move along the edges and say, yeah, you know, it's a struggle. I'd like to share Laura's image, if you can bring that one up. The next one, I think it's, yeah. Well, that pretty much says it all, right? You know, they don't have to necessarily be images. Hers are all words with a lot of no, things being X'd out. I mean, you can see how intense it is. And it was wonderful for her to be able to share that. It was wonderful for us, you know, to be able to witness, to hold the space for each other, and just have a, you know, a safe container for ourselves. And I think it's, you know, it's been really important and really special that we've been able to do this.
Well, falling back a little bit on what soothes you and what calms you,
Yeah.
so very important. I guess I fell back on my Italian American genes and I started cooking right away. So whenever there's a crisis, I just make like 3 things of lasagna. I don't know what that means, but now I wish I wasn't cooking every day, but at least I have 3 trays of lasagna. And falling back on my Irish American heritage, started, writing stories. I love storytelling and writing stories. So, finding that expressiveness within you and what resonates with you. Barbara, I think you wanted to also share some images that you've been working on as well.
Yeah, and I would say that I was on spring break in Florida and came back to find out that the spring break had been extended. And so within 1 week's time, I had to convert face-to-face courses to online courses. So that utterly consumed the first several weeks. And it was a difficult transition to go to a virtual world. And then Sharon and I were in touch, and I started hearing about the wonderful group that was happening, and thankfully was invited to join. And so if you'll bring up the image, what happened was I think because of the level of actual demand, work demand, I had so much to do within a short period of time to work with students, adapt the curriculum, and was carrying a lot of tension somatically, which resulted in some problems with sleeping, and so, which is atypical for me. So what happened is one night after I had joined the group, I woke up at 2 in the morning and said, okay, I'm going to take this opportunity to make some art. However, most of my art supplies are in Canada because I just moved in August. So I had to rummage around and find some materials. And, as people have been talking about, you use what's available. So I used some materials that were very unfamiliar, but found that in the process of experimenting with them and working with them and not really knowing where this was going to go, this particular image emerged. And it was helpful to look at it the next day, and then also to look at it within the context of the group, because I think what it's representing to me is old structures being boarded up, both personally but also systemically. The structures that we've depended upon now need to change, need to be renovated, modified. We're looking out on this kind of swirling landscape that is unfamiliar. There is a bright spring green coming through, so there's the hopefulness of new life. And I did not think this out, but it just sort of came out, this image of, I don't know if it's a moon or an egg, but and I didn't even recognize it as such. I just wanted to put this area of brightness in the overall image. So there's some sense of something incubating, of waiting, of possibility, of something that will be born in this. It's just unclear what that will be. And then I ended up calling this the watchers, the sense that there is this sort of quality of watching and waiting and tending to see what changes emerge in the midst of all of this. So, so that was the first image. And incidentally, my sleep did normalize after that. It was very helpful, the physical aspect. And this one I did, I had a session with a client who's really suffering and is having a very difficult time. And I didn't specifically do this in response to the session, but what I found myself wanting to do after the session was to engage in art making. And so I actually picked some paper that was used in between pastel paper. It's this sort of translucent paper. and used oil pastels and started adding color. Initially, this sort of very bright red, deep reds, then darker colors, and then just started scratching away, literally, the marks, and then these figures started to develop. So I wasn't thinking it through, it was just sort of organically developing. But in the end, my first word association was huddling, and the second one was suffering. And there's this sense of, you know, we're in this, there is suffering that together, and a sense of huddling and mourning. The figure in the center is not alone. I would say it's a she, and there's somebody looking at her, facing with her, being with her, and there are others looking on. So this was just kind of a spontaneous response to what I was resonating in the story of my client's life.
Thank you all so much for sharing all that, and for sharing everything here today in conversation about the expressive arts. And sort of in closing, I wanted to know if any of you wanted to share any of the resources recommended for clinicians interested in exploring use of the arts therapeutically, either for their own use or for their clients' use.
So there are a lot of resources on the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. If you go to that site, Dr. Niemeyer has a lot of principles of practice offerings that you can click on and read from Portland Institute faculty and presenters, and that there's going to be some more uploads, you know, of webinars. I think this presentation will be uploaded onto the site. So that's a real resource. There's opportunities to work with mentors. You know, if you really are looking to work using art therapy or art-assisted grief therapy, you can work with someone who will help to guide you through. But lots and lots of resources. I would definitely go to the site and log on and take advantage of what's there.
And you know, I would also add to that, Jill, ADEC, that out of this experience, there is going to be, I think, creative writing, a lot of creative products, and we'll be thinking together through all of this. I feel that ADEC is a learning community. I'm part of this learning community through ADEC, so I really appreciate your spearheading these webinar offerings so that we can have conversations together as we move through this and into the future.
I'm so glad all of you could join us here today. Sarah, I didn't know if you had any resources maybe you wanted to share with us as well.
I would just echo what both Sharon and Barbara said. You know, I was sad that the ADEC conference I was so sad that this was canceled this year, but I know we're all going to be there together next year, and I'm really happy that they're making all these different resources available virtually right now. So I feel like one of the good things that's happening at this time is that a lot of people are reaching out virtually to provide different types of support and resources. So ADEC's doing a great job, and the Portland Institute, we were supposed to have a retreat also this spring that was canceled. We were going to be presenting there, but we're hoping, fingers crossed, that the event in September will still be happening and we'll all be out there. So some good things coming. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this community. So thank you for having us here.
Absolutely, and I've been really fortunate in my 20+ years as a social worker to work collaboratively with my art therapists and to provide that holistic approach to caring for patients going through major crises or illness or loss. And having a daughter right now who's on the front lines working at a grocery store here in Northern Virginia, who is also expresses herself through art, and you know, having those anxious moments of having to be there and coming home. And she recently picked up her pen and paper again, and is really, that's her way of coping. So, but we're so fortunate to have you here today talking about COVID-19 and the expressive arts. Thank you so much for sharing your talents and your wisdom here with us today. I do think it's going to be really interesting to see the creations that come out of this. So as you were speaking, it kind of reminded me, all of a sudden I got this visualization in my head of Pablo Picasso and everything that was created during, what was it called, the wars. I think one of his pictures.
Guernica.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just popped into my mind. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our passion, what we love, and you know, hopefully we've you know, inspired some of you out there to create.
Well, we're just really fortunate that you were able to spend this time today here with our ADEC members as they're out dealing with COVID-19 and taking care of clients and patients as well as themselves. It's been a stressful time for a lot of us. So thank you so much for sharing with ADEC here today. And I forgot Sarah too. I said Sharon, Barbara, and Sarah. So, and for all you that are listening, be well, be safe. I hope you're practicing good social distancing, safe social distancing, and wash your hands. So on behalf of ADEC, thank you very much for joining us here today in conversation.
Thank you.